Okay, great. So now, pivoting into the actual formal talk, I'm going to focus on the word that governs the second chapter of the book, which is cost. And so the reason this is a powerful word, one reason, is that when people think about the word cost, they often automatically feel horror. In focus groups, paid for by End Climate Silence, respondents said that the word cost reminds them of phrases like the amount of money I need to give up, or money I don't want to spend, or even the sensation I don't have enough money. So strategically, politicians who oppose climate policy will highlight the word cost to raise the fear that climate action will force each of us to spend money we simply don't have. So, for example, when he announced the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, Donald Trump said that the pact was, quote, the largest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States and leaving American workers who I love and taxpayers to absorb the cost. Senators and Fox News commentators also use this strategy. They draw on this implicatory power of the word cost to make us start worrying about our wallets. The truth is, though, climate action will not require personal, painful financial sacrifice. In the end, rather than impoverishing us, successfully decarbonizing our economy will make the vast majority of Americans more prosperous. Indeed, for the majority, decarbonization is not a cost, it's a benefit. In fact, it's a windfall. And climate communicators should talk about it as such. Admittedly, it may be kind of hard to see how that's the case. Right now, this truth is largely obscured by the language that even climate advocates use to understand the economic dimensions of the climate crisis and its resolution. And this language is derived from someone putatively on our side, an economist named William Nordhaus. A slim, dapper man with a narrow face and foxy silver hair, Nordhaus created the field of climate economics basically whole cloth. He built the first cost-benefit integrated assessment climate model, which he named the Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, or DICE. He loves using gambling metaphors in his work. It's actually extremely creepy. DICE combines elements of climate science with 20th century theories about maximizing economic growth to help policymakers balance the estimated costs of reducing emissions today with the estimated costs of future climate damages. Using DICE, policymakers can attempt to calculate what Nordhaus called the optimal price trajectory for a carbon tax. This tax, in his model, supposedly drives consumer demand and other market forces to most efficiently decarbonize the economy at a speed that maximizes the wealth of future generations. Because remember, that's his primary goal. So in DICE, Nordhaus recommends that a carbon tax be applied at a low level and then gradually be ramped up in a sort of gentle slope. This means that he's telling policymakers to delay the decarbonization of the economy and rather invest public and indeed private money in financial products with higher short-term yields than climate projects. This way, the world can establish what he defines as the optimal balance between the costs of climate damages and the benefits of economic growth, which he imagines as being enabled by fossil fuel use and fossil fuel development. I take that belief up in chapter 3 and hopefully demolish it. I try, I don't know, it was fun to write at least. So, the crazy thing though, is that in his model, Nordhaus finds that the optimal trajectory for decarbonization will not halt warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, or even the 2 degrees Celsius, which is sort of the upper level of the Paris Agreement. Rather, His model finds that the economically optimal thing is to let the world heat up to 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, timing it so we keep using fossil fuels until the last possible second, getting us to 3 degrees Celsius. Now, one problem with having 3 degrees Celsius as the optimal target for heating is that this target ignores what climate science shows will happen if the world heats up that much in just a few decades, essentially a geological instant. I probably don't need to remind anyone here today that the last time the Earth was 3 degrees Celsius warmer was 3 million years ago, before humans even existed, when camels and alligators lived in the Arctic, and the coastline of what would become the eastern United States ended 100 miles west in the middle of North Carolina, say, because the seas were so much higher. Much of the rest of the planet was barren savanna. If our economy heats up the planet 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, its current configuration will break down and be arranged, or rearranged, I should say, into something much closer to that Pliocene system, which of course means destroying the conditions on which civilization was built. This is why the climate scientists, Johan Rockström, for example, says that Nordhaus's approach is, quote, simply not aligned with climate science. It is an unequivocal finding in the natural sciences, Rockström goes on to say, that a 3 degrees Celsius of warming would be a disastrous outcome for humanity. Now, I just want to make it clear that I am not implying that Nordhaus is a climate denier. He acknowledges that climate change is real, he sees its dangers, and I do believe that within his ideological cage, he's imagining what he envisions as the best outcome for, if not humanity, at least people in the United States. But that's because in his ideological cage, he's working with certain false assumptions. The first such assumption is that economic growth indeed has the power to protect us from economic devastation. I'm just going to pause it here, and you're going to have to trust me on this, or maybe read the book, that this is built on nothing, this belief. And in fact, all evidence points to the contrary. His second major assumption is that growth is only marginally affected by climate damages. And the reason he's able to sustain that assumption is that he omits so many climate damages from his DICE model. He omits damages to labor productivity, to non-coastal real estate, including buildings and infrastructure. He omits damages to manufacturing, mining, transportation, communication, finance, insurance. You see what's happening in California. You can't get insurance in California. Nordhaus doesn't think about that. Retail and wholesale trade, government services, and above all, agriculture. For him, agriculture is just this tiny little piece of our GDP, so if it collapses, it doesn't actually affect the core of the economy.
So what does he believe in? He omits everything.
He models coastal damages and some damages from heat. That's it. Finally, he also admits climate system tipping points, as well as unlikely but nonetheless possible civilization-ending events that could be spurred by climate breakdown and civilizational collapse, like nuclear war. The Columbia University economist Noah Kaufman says that to call the cost projections produced by Nordhaus's model the best estimate without accounting for all of these other possible damages is like, quote, a bit like counting up all the stars you can see in the sky and claiming that that result is our best estimate of the total stars in the universe. Nordhaus's low estimate of climate damages is important because it's on this low estimate that rests his assessment of the cost of climate action. He always looks at the cost of decarbonization relative to the cost of climate change itself. And because he imagines perpetual growth and low climate damages, climate action in his model is always less worth it than just continuing to use fossil fuels. Now, Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for his work in 2018. And in his Nobel speech, he reaffirmed his recommendation that policymakers time the implementation and increase of a carbon tax such that our economy heats up the world 3 degrees Celsius, basically, by 2100. I cannot overstate how influential Nordhaus has been with both Republican and Democratic policymakers. So for me, this is a really prime example of how someone on our side is producing a discourse that helps fossil fuel interests remain in place. However, the paradigm of climate economics is actually starting to shift. In a field-changing 2015 paper by Marshall Burke of Stanford University and Solomon Shung of UC Berkeley, Burke and Shung observed historical responses to what they call temperature variability in order to update Nordhaus's damage function. They find that the slope of this damage function is 2.5 to 100 times larger than anything Nordhaus estimated. And using this new damage function, Burke and Shung found that, quote, unmitigated warming is expected to reshape the global economy by reducing average global incomes by roughly 23% by 2100 relative to a world without climate change. A 2020 study by Chinese economists extended this analysis, showing that 3 degrees Celsius of global heating will cost the world between $126 and $616 trillion in the next 80 years, compared to 1.5 degrees Celsius of heating or below. $616 trillion is basically double the amount of money that currently exists in the world. And a study published this past April in the top scientific journal Nature found that even if we stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, climate change, as we are expecting it just now, is going to cost the world $38 trillion per year by 2050, when my kid is going to be in his 40s, and hopefully otherwise, you know, at the peak of his career and family life. I want to say that $38 trillion per year is double the GDP of Europe. Now, the more we use fossil fuels, the longer this goes on, the more expensive climate change is going to be. And I don't even know if expensive is really the appropriate adjective. At this point, I think ruinous is really a better word. So compared to this, decarbonization, getting fossil fuels out of our systems, is a bargain. With some scientific reticence, Burke noted in a 2018 paper that 1.5 degrees Celsius global heating is likely, as he put it, to result in substantial economic benefits, even relative to 2C of warming. Even economists who use DICE have come to agree with this projection. Using the updated damage function and other empirical improvements, 2 2020 studies using DICE by independent teams of economists in Germany found that a temperature target below 2 degrees Celsius was optimal. When economists add what they call natural capital to their models, i.e. everything so-called nature does for civilization for free, they find that limiting temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius is optimal. And new cost-effectiveness models are showing how we meet those temperature targets more cheaply than we could have even imagined. One such model run calculated that just 1/10 of the COVID-19 stimulus money that circulated in the first years of the pandemic, directed towards decarbonization for 5 years, would be sufficient to deliver the goals of the Paris Agreement and stop global heating well below 2 degrees Celsius. I mean, that is a bargain. One reason that climate action suddenly seems so affordable is that economists are increasingly modeling how technological progress and the interactions between innovation and finance lowers the costs of energy transitions. We only have to look at the plunge in the cost of computers, say, to understand how that kind of thing works. And as computers, so for example, electric vehicles. In the past decade, the price of lithium-ion storage batteries has dropped almost 90%, despite the fact that the dominant climate models assumed electric vehicles would remain more expensive than cars with internal combustion engines all the way to 2100. Currently, in the United States, there are about 4 EVs with ranges of about 300 miles or more that are cheaper than the average gasoline-powered car. The price of utility-scale batteries, a partial solution to the so-called intermittency problems of renewables, has also plummeted, falling 70% between 2015 and 2018 alone. And since the price of fossil fuels doesn't follow learning curves, in fact, it's a commodity that gets traded, for huge profits, we should expect that the price difference between fossil fuels and safe energy will only widen in the future. Indeed, American ratepayers will pay less for electricity from safe energy sources. A study from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley found that if we decarbonize the grid 90% by 2035, we would cause electricity prices to drop a full 10%. And this is likely an underestimate because even just Obama's Clean Power Plan dropped electricity prices by 14%. Through his group, Rewiring America, the MacArthur Genius Fellow Saul Griffith found that a national transition to solar-powered, fully electrified homes with electric appliances replacing gas heating and cooking and electric vehicles replacing fossil fuel cars could save the average household, once those machines were in place, up to a staggering $25,000 a year. That is a lot of money. In the 2020 campaign, Vice President Kamala Harris often noted that most Americans don't even have an extra $400 on hand for emergencies. Imagine not having an extra $400 and then being able to save tens of thousands of dollars annually. Such a rise in real income could be life-changing. And study after study shows we can afford to get this decarbonized system up and running. Assessing multiple scenarios leading to net zero emissions, a 2020 Princeton report shows that the US could spend about what it currently spends on energy alone, about 4 to 6% of GDP, and decarbonize its entire economy by 2050. A 2021 study out of the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory finds an even lower price for continuing to have a future, only between 0.2% and 1.2% of GDP. And for perspective, it's well to remember that during the FDR administration, federal spending reached about 47% of GDP, leading to an extended period of prosperity, at least for white Americans. Now, neither of those studies I just cited even took the health benefits of decarbonization into account. But once you factor in the costs of air pollution, you find that no longer burning fossil fuels will literally pay for itself within a decade. Drew Schindel, the Nicholas Professor of Earth Science at Duke University and a lead IPCC author, recently spoke to Congress about his team's latest research. He testified that even leaving climate breakdown out of his models, decarbonizing quickly enough to halt global warming at 2 degrees Celsius would, in the next 50 years, prevent enough sickness and death from air pollution that would create a healthcare and labor savings of over $700 billion a year, an amount of money that by 2050 will well pay for the cost of decarbonization. And Schindel emphasized, Americans will make this money from decarbonizing no matter what the rest of the world does. Running a version of their scenario in which the US came into compliance with a 2C pathway, but the rest of the world continued to use coal, oil, and gas. Schindler's team found that unilateral American action would afford us more than 2/3 of the health benefits of global action over the next 15 years alone. Now, as affordable and lucrative as the transition to a net zero economy really is, you have to admit that its upfront capital outlay is real. Like any money-making endeavor, you have to spend money to make money. But you have to think of these outlays not as costs, but as investments. Not money lost, but money used to make money. These investments will create new professions and new jobs. The Goldman School UC Berkeley study, for example, projects that climate action will create at least 500,000 new jobs a year. The Inflation Reduction Act, Biden's signature climate law, as small and inadequate as it is, has already created over 300,000 jobs in the United States. Among the lowest earners, unemployment was 1%. But Americans stuck in this economic bracket would be eligible to work in the construction, conservation, caregiving, restoration, and adaptation trades that are essential to a safe, zero-emissions economy. Indeed, the national project of decarbonization could be precisely the historical event that repairs the income inequality and the social fracturing of the neoliberal era. Still, if you talk about decarbonization in this way, as an economic benefit, a windfall to the 99, or at least the 90th percent, that can be easily gained with like minimal capital investment, you will surely be asked, well, where do we get the money to make these investments? Scholars give a variety of answers to this question. If you're a modern monetary theory economist, you will say they can be paid for by procurement, whereby the Fed can just print the money for all of this, print whatever money Congress allocates. And this is not going to create inflation in this case because there are going to be so many new goods and services that all of this liquidity is going to be mopped up in the creation of new industries and in all of these new consumer goods. So we're not actually going to have rising prices because all the money is immediately going to go into a decarbonized economy. Now, if you're more conservative but still progressive, like say Paul Krugman, you don't think MMT works in the context of global exchange, fine. But then you're still hawkish about borrowing the money to make these changes because decarbonizing is such an economic benefit that the loan will pay for itself. It's just part of the investment. Or if you're more centrist and you like a pay-as-you-go kind of thing, one thing you could do perhaps is raise taxes on the super rich. Any of these methods would effectively socialize decarbonization investments so that the vast majority of individual consumers wouldn't really feel them. If you think about how much money the federal government spent to stabilize the financial system in 2007, 2008, just tremendous amounts of money, $70 billion or something like that. I'm perhaps getting this wrong. I challenge any of us to say exactly how much of that came out of our own pockets in particular. So the question to ask then is not how much will decarbonization cost, or even how will we pay for it, but who stands to benefit? I have been arguing that most Americans will benefit, will come out better off once we've decarbonized. But it also remains the case that fossil fuel interests and the 1% and their political allies stand to lose a great deal of money. Scientists have calculated that to meet even a 2 degrees Celsius target, 1/3 of oil reserves, half of gas reserves or methane reserves, and over 80% of current coal reserves must remain unused. This unburnable carbon and the infrastructure of its production is currently included in fossil fuel companies' listed equity, which are valuations, of course, that do not reflect the reality of the climate crisis. For this reason, decarbonization will be a political struggle. And it will be very challenging to establish that we are going to manage the decline of the fossil fuel industry and negotiate with the petrostates to update their economies so as to have a global net zero system. One thing that will help is Congress needs to stop artificially inflating the value of oil and gas companies with subsidies, and they need to legislate climate risk disclosure in order to encourage the private sector to reallocate capital to companies planning to create value from the zero emissions systemic revolution. Happily, one recent development has made the challenge easier. And I know this is going to sound kind of amazing or implausible considering the level of profit that the fossil fuel companies have been showing since Putin invaded Ukraine. But the fossil fuel industry is actually no longer a pillar of the American economy. Due to automation and consolidation, fossil fuel companies are shedding jobs. Only about 500,000 people now work in mining and oil and gas extraction, compared to the 1.7 million people who work in, say, real estate, which is a sector directly threatened by climate change. The oil and gas worker is fast becoming a mythical figure in American culture, akin to the cowboys in 1950s film and television, representing a nostalgic invocation of a past expansion of American imperial power. Instead, today, the fastest growing job in America is solar installer. And miners and oil and gas workers know this themselves. During Biden's first term, the United Mine Workers of America, America's largest coal union, announced that it would accept a transition away from fossil fuels in exchange for new jobs in renewable energy. Its proposed transition plan asked the federal government to encourage safe energy development in former coal country, retrain miners to work in safe energy industries, guarantee their wages, health insurance, and pensions, and support their families in other ways during the transition. Now, this is exactly the kind of systemic approach to climate policy set out by the Green New Deal and a multiracial working class movement allied with tech investors and entrepreneurs and suburban and urban concerned and alarmed people can build a coalition pressing for this kind of systemic transformation. The systemic approach of the Green New Deal, centered on public investment that makes people's lives better immediately, will not only create new industries and new jobs, but will also ensure that no worker gets left behind in the safe energy revolution. It will ensure that we move to decarbonize our economy at the scale and speed required to halt global heating well below 2 degrees Celsius. It will make the majority of Americans healthier and wealthier, more prosperous, more able to devote their resources and their energy to their children's futures. Fossil fuel interests and rich people are trying to block decarbonization and to prevent the federal government from making these investments. That is why, insofar as they support climate policy as a greenwash in order to extend their license to operate, oil and gas companies and Republicans and other fossil fuel interests support policies that impose costs directly on workers and consumers, such as a carbon tax in exchange for negating any other regulations. And they highlight the putative costs of climate policy at every turn. But climate communicators, all of us in this room, anyone who's watching this on YouTube, can neutralize this strategy by emphasizing instead the costs of climate damages, which are real and unavoidable unless we phase out fossil fuels. Use powerful and effective narratives already emerging all around us of Americans whose homes and businesses and health have been destroyed already by the harms of the climate crisis at only 1.2 degrees Celsius of heating. Then, once you've painted that picture for people, in contrast to both fossil fuel interests and neoliberal economists, we can stand on ever-growing heaps of economic evidence to say that decarbonization is a benefit, indeed a windfall, that will put money directly into most Americans' pockets. And that the investments the United States needs to make to decarbonize its systems will be distributed socially. They will not be felt in that wallet. Talking about the economic dimension of the climate crisis in this way is not only accurate and justified, it's also politically efficacious. Calling decarbonization a benefit both exposes and neutralizes the fantasy maintained by tendentious economic modeling that just growing our GDP will save us from climate devastation. And I think it introduces something new and really important into the language of climate politics. An understanding that an economic system which takes ecological considerations into account can actually increase human flourishing. Thank you for listening.